for the benefit of everyone on the call, the subject that Professor Salman will be speaking about is Islamophobia and racism.
When you say to people Islamophobia is a type of racism, you often get this idea that, well, it can't be because Islam is a religion, and therefore, and Muslims come from many, many different races, and therefore, why are we talking about Islamophobia as racism? Okay. So firstly, I want to talk a little bit about the practical idea of what racism is and how that can affect people and what will be useful. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think we should understand Islamophobia as racism. And then I'm going to try to deal with some of the arguments against all of this. Now, the first thing is this, that the reason why I wanted to talk about racism, Islamophobia as racism, is because after about 50 years at least of anti-colonial and anti-racist struggle, you have achieved a situation in which most people understand what racism is instinctively in terms of practice, right? To give you a very obvious example, even if you go back, and I'm sure there are many people on this call who go back to the 90s or late 90s, and would say, for example, if you were going to football matches in this country, you would often get racist chants against Black players, you'd get banana skins thrown at them, and the response of the officials, the commentators, was, well, this is a bit of fun, it shouldn't really be taken seriously, and no one ever got kicked out of a ground, etc., etc. Now, at least in most of the major stadiums, if anyone did that, they're quite likely to be thrown out. And what happens, though, is that ordinary people in the stadium are able to point out this is racism, or when someone shouts and things like that, and contact the stewards. So you've had a situation in which, in the space of very 50 odd years, the idea and understanding of racism has now become generalized across the across society. So people may not understand the legal definition of racism, but they kind of can see it and identify it sufficiently to take action against it. Now, when you talk about Islamophobia as a form of racism, what you're trying to do is tap into that foregrounded knowledge. You're trying to link it up and to make everyone's job easier by saying, look, Islamophobia is not that complicated. You don't need to know to be an expert on Islamic history or Islamic philosophy or the tenets of the religion. If it looks like racism, then it is racism. And in a sense, if the fact that it's directed against Muslims is not relevant in the sense that it is simply a form of racism. Okay, so that's the first part of this thing, that we're talking about a time in which there is a general opprobrium. Now, I don't want to be too sanguine about this, but I would say to you that we live in a world where nobody wants to be a racist, even though there is racism. So I'm not saying there's no more racism, but even racists don't want to be called racist. And I think that's important to recognize that. So there is a certain kind of force when if you, which racism now has, which can be useful. Now, anyone who looks at Islamophobia will see that Islamophobia doesn't have that same force. You get many people supposedly off the left who would say things like, I'm proud to be an Islamophobe. Even people of the right do not say, I'm proud to be a racist. Even the EDL would not say, I'm proud to be a racist. But even people, Guardian readers or column writers of the Guardian can say, I'm proud to be an Islamophobe. So we have a misrecognition at a certain level around the notion of Islamophobia and racism. So the first point is this, to try and understand it. If you understand Islamophobia as a form of racism, you start doing this work. You can start making those kinds of linkages, and you can actually combat Islamophobia better. Okay. So here, what I want to say very carefully is that the point about having a definition or an understanding of Islamophobia is really what working can do. This is not a purely kind of intellectual exercise, but it is a practical exercise. Yeah, and the point about Islamophobia is to understand it, to weaken it, to eradicate it, rather than to sort of draw pictures around it. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, but I don't want to dismiss that there isn't a strong intellectual argument about racism and Islamophobia. And I will do this by looking at the question of what constitutes racism. Let's start with two propositions. One is that racism is something which comes about because wherever you look in the world, people are divided into races, and races cause racism. Basically, what causes racism is having different races in one place, and that leads to racism. But this is a very common understanding. It's something that people say instinctively, but it is also, just because it's common, it doesn't mean that it's not wrong. In fact, it's very wrong, simply because racism is prior to the construction of races. In other words, racism makes races rather than races making racism. That is really, really important, and to have that idea in our heads, because it is the idea that there are of racism that divides up people into races. And as a consequence, what we think is an objective natural reality of races is actually a validation of racism. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point that I want to make is really looking at the notion of racism as people try to understand it. And often you hear this language, well, look, you know what? It's all right for sociologists and other people who do this sort of work to talk about races being constructed. For the ordinary person on the omnibus or the pub when they were open or wherever they might be, they know what races is. Races are basically biological. You can look at somebody and you know what race they belong to. So here we have two arguments. One is that racism is a cultural phenomenon. Races are cultural groupings. Another one that they're actually groupings that you can work out through people's phenotypes. And the argument then is that the biological one is the one that everybody holds. Everybody, more or less, who is not a sociologist or goes to university accepts the biological definition, and it's only people who go to university in particular subjects who don't accept that. And therefore, and the reality belongs to the people who are the most numerous in this. I would say to you, there are definitely two views, but it is not clear that the view which is commonly held is the biological view. Because most people, when they talk about racism, they don't do so using the language and understanding of the biological racism per se, because they're not necessarily skilled in doing so. What they do is either things that they've inherited or they've heard, and they repeat them. So they may say things like that, well, we know this person is a different race because they are a different race. So take, for example, England. In England, you'll often hear people being described as Asian. And you think, well, of course, this is a biological necessity. But often when they mean Asian, they mean people from either India, Bangladesh, or Pakistan, a little bit Sri Lanka, but those are the three main countries. And even on some of the formal data, you will have things like Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi. Now, neither Indian or Pakistani or even Bangladeshi name particular ethnic groups or biological entities. These are nation states, these are nationalities, rather than anything else. So either Pakistan or India, you could see that, you know, there are very many differences. However, in the context of Britain, when you say there was an Asian man, you know what you are saying. You are saying about this. And when you say Asian man, then you are using those properties and markers that you think just make someone Asian as a sign that they already have that. So you are thinking you are reading their Asianness when in fact you are actually imposing that Asianness. Now, you go to the United States, if you could travel, and you say, I met this Asian man. They are unlikely to be thinking about the same person. And they would be thinking mainly somebody from Japanese or Korean or Vietnamese extraction. It's a completely different kind of thing. And I'm not even going to get into the problem whether Asia actually names a race or not. So when you see how people are talking about groupings of certain types, they talk about groups, how they are made in their particular society that they're comfortable with. And these are always, always infused with cultural properties. They do not have those kinds of markers. This is why some groups can disappear. So at one point in this country, it was quite easy or important to tell people who were Catholic or not, or tell people who were Irish or not, compared to Scottish. Now, it's very, very difficult for people to know who is Irish or not, or of Irish ancestry, because even their names become confused in a way. You can kind of guess, but it disappears. Or the Huguenots, you could probably think, but you'd have to have a certain kind of literacy to work out who is Huguenot or not. So what do these examples actually share and say is demonstrate to us a change in the way in which these formations are described and the way that they function. Because they show a change, if they were biologically determined, they would not be changing. They would be the same, because that's what biology would do. So even when people talk that they're using that language, they're not. They're using a language they're comfortable with, and that is a language of understanding of social groupings in particular contexts. So the argument that Muslims are not a race is totally irrelevant to this situation, because what you see is the racialization of Muslims. And I can give you 3 examples. How long do you want me to talk for, by the way? Just a quick. I can't hear you, sorry. You're muted. Naeem, you're muted.
Yeah, would you consider 5 to 7 minutes?
Yep, that's fine. I can do that.
Sure.
Yeah. Because I want to talk a little bit about Muslimness, so I just want to factor that in.
Sure,
Okay?
sure.
Take something like the FBI. Why not? The FBI has outsourced training courses, how to spot a Muslim. Yeah. When you go through airports, you will often find that there is a sense in how Muslims are spotted by how you identify a Muslim. Now, I don't know how many people are here. If there are any Muslims among the 76 participants, they would all, and if they've ever been to airports, I'm sure they know what I'm talking about. There is a category which has emerged about Muslims flying while Muslim, or even being near an airport while Muslim, yeah? Now, how did this happen? How is it that people can spot a Muslim regardless of their national identity or their complexion or all the normal markers? You can say, well, it's easy. Muslim men have beards, and they talk like they have certain things, and you can work out, and you can, you know, and if you say Allah Akbar to them or Assalamu alaikum, or if you listen to them carefully and they will say Inshallah, that's a good giveaway, etc. Right? So you have this paraphernalia of this, and we've all heard of comical stories about people on planes being kicked off and things like that, and whatever, for speaking in tongues and all this thing. But what you have now is a emerging science, or some would say pseudoscience, but that's irrelevant, which helps to identify and spot a Muslim. But so Muslims are being treated as a category which can be surveilled, which can be regulated, which can be disciplined, despite any of the various distinctions that they may have. They may be of recent European heritage, they may be of African heritage, they may be of South Asian heritage. It doesn't matter. They can be can become Muslims. You will notice that one of the things that the far right and even the less far right in Europe now talks about how Europe is being overcome with 30 million to 50 million Muslims. What do they actually mean? Now, if you look at some of these political parties, 40, 30 years ago, they wouldn't be talking about Europe being overcome by Muslims. They would be saying in France, there are too many people from Maghreb, there are too many Moroccans, too many Senegalese. In Germany, be too many Kurds and too many Turks. And in Britain, you know, what they were. So in a sense, even what's happened isn't that more Muslims have just arrived. It is now that in Germany, there are Muslims, which used to be called Kurds and Turks. In England, there are Muslims who are totally Pakistanis and Bangladeshis mainly. In France, who Maghrebis and Senegalese, they've all now been reclassified as Muslims. And they are then treated as Muslims. And we know that, for example, you try doing this experiment, have an identical CV, apply for a job, and your name is, I don't know, Naeem Muhammad, for example, and you have someone identical CV and their name is Joe Bloggs, well, not Joe Bloggs because probably it's a connotation, but you could imagine the thing, John Smith, and you know who will get the job and demonstrate it again and again, who is hired for reviews, etc. And there's so many different examples of this. Okay. So the last few minutes I want to talk about is this category of Muslimness, which I think is really, really crucial. One of the problems that people often talk about is, well, we haven't really, you know, got a sense of what Muslimness might be. And we need to understand that Islamophobia is really the hatred or the antagonism of Islam. And I can see why they would want to say that. But let's just look at some of the examples. In 14th or 15th of September 2001, a man with a beard and a turban was shot in the United States in retaliation for the attacks on New York and Washington and 9/11. The killer made it very clear that he wanted to kill a Muslim, and he went to this gas station or petrol station, and the owner of that gas station wore a turban and had a beard and was shot. His name was Babil Singh Sodhi. Now, again, many Muslims of South Asian, and most Muslims recognize this is not a common Muslim name. And in fact, the man who was shot was not Muslim. He was shot because he exhibited Muslimness, qualities that people associated with being a Muslim. It did not depend on whether you were a Muslim or not. Similarly, the idea that Muslims, Islamophobia only directed to people who are more pious, more devoted to being Muslim, isn't followed through. What you have is a flexible list of moving qualities and attributes which are said to be describe Muslims or are a sign of being a Muslim. In France, the example that I've often used is that you will notice there's been a huge thing on the hijab, on the use of the hijab, and laws in France and Belgium and other places began to ban the hijab. So you say because they argue that it was a religious symbol, but in practice, it was really to do with, well, in practice, it was really to do with, you know, Islam, in a sense. It was a question of Muslimness there. Now, certain head teachers in France and authorities have decided to say that Muslim students whose skirts are long are exhibiting Muslimness. So it is now moved from the headscarf, which they're allowed to wear, to the length of the skirt. Or to give you a historical example, in sort of the 17th century, after the conquest of Granada, Muslims were identified because they used olive oil in their diet. If you used olive oil, you were a Muslim. Or the other one, if you had a bath or a shower frequently, i.e. more than once a month, perhaps, or once a week, you were a Muslim. So you can see that there are different kind of core markers of what was considered to be Muslim at any particular time. So finally, to conclude, Islamophobia is a type of racism, because racism is about regulation and disciplining of bodies and populations, which targets Muslimness. That's what differentiates it. It is about targeting Muslimness, which combines both of being associated with being a Muslim. It doesn't depend on how devoted you are or not. It doesn't depend on whether you have a beard or not, or the length of your beard or how you're dressed. All of these things are put together to determine what is a Muslim. And this is a flexible thing, but you, as a Muslim, know when it's happening. And one of the things that we want to do with this definition is allow ordinary Muslims to say, look, I have felt upset, uneven, or whatever about this thing, but now I know that it is a type of racism. It is to allow them to do that. And it's allowed those who have the business in some public organizations badly to deal with these issues, to say, oh, if this is a form of racism and I have a complaint by an employee that this is something, I do not need to become a kind of a scholar of Islam or become a scholar in fiqh to work out whether it is or not. All I need is to see that if there is something that looks like the way racism would be, even though it is attacking or targeting Muslims. To give you one final example on this, and I'll finish, and I hope that I haven't gone too long over my time. A friend of mine once told me that they were on a tube, and they got onto the tube in London, and there was a woman there with a large dog who was talking, saw them and started talking to the dog, saying, they don't like you. And clearly what she was saying was that the dog, these people do not like you because Muslims don't like dogs. It happens this person actually owns a dog. Now, the point is this, not liking a dog is not necessarily anything that you would say is problematic, but you would understand it, that it isn't meant as a welcoming comment. Yeah? So the point that I'm trying to make here is this, that the question of what constitutes Muslimness will be transformed in the context we find ourselves. But what we want to do is empower and enable people to take Islamophobia seriously as a way of leveraging transformation in society. And one way to do that is to recognize that its effects are the same logic of racism. And if we do that, then we are in a better position to leverage the entire heritage, both governmental, non-governmental, of anti-colonial and anti-racist struggles, to build on those struggles, to undo and to contest Islamophobia. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I mean, this is not to trivialize how we do it, but it's just in the interest of time, if you can, perhaps in a minute or two, advise us as individuals and collectively as organizations, advocacy groups, and Muslim community, faith-based groups. What is it that we need to do in combating Islamophobia? Because the definition, the definition of racism is one that's being accepted by the all-party group of Muslims. But what is it that we as individuals and collectively need to do in actually combating Islamophobia?
So look, I think you need to understand that the struggle against Islamophobia is a political struggle, right? In this part, the idea the APG had is not an idea that I particularly share, because their idea was this, that they would be able to get legislation in place and they would be able to use a definition and have legislation. The history of anti-racist struggle shows that the legislation comes last or comes later. It's the mobilization that needs to precede that, because things will happen. If you have legislation without mobilization, that means you have legislation without education. It means that the judges, the courts, the lawyers will not understand it either, because they haven't been. And we know this is the case, for example, with racism, because it wasn't that racism was never taken seriously because the population hadn't been educated to understand what racism was. So to give very, in the early 80s, and I'll get on to what organizations need to do. I know you asked me to do it in 1 minute, but I'll try and do this, but I think it's important.
Yes.
The experience of African and Afro-Caribbean men was that they were being stopped by the police. And all the kind of retired majors in Brighton and elsewhere would say, well, that's never happened to me, so they're making this up, right? So that meant that the police itself was scared. The police is good. Now, in the Metropolitan Police, after a while of these campaigns, 70% of people said, well, actually, the Metropolitan Police is racist. And they were not just people who were of people of color. It became generalized because they understood that was happening too many times. So the first thing to do is to understand this as a political operation and to move towards accepting the idea of Islamophobia as racism, rather than trying to find the ideal magic formula that will give us some kind of magic spell that will dispel racism. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to actually understand, by making a very short definition, what we want to do is allow 10-year-old children to have access to it. So really what organizations can do in the first instance is through training, through mass kind of mobilization, popularization, spread the word that this is what Islamophobia is. Do not be deterred by, do not on the government, because this government is not going to legislate willingly, if at all. That's not relevant. When there are other agencies that are able to take this on, if we can build up enough pressure, if the Muslim community itself can say, this is what Islamophobia is, if we can persuade our allies this is what Islamophobia is, it doesn't really matter, because then what will happen is that judges and lawyers and courts will start saying, well, actually, in the kind of normal understanding of these things, this is what Islamophobia is. Sorry, go on.
No. So the point that you're making.
Sorry.
Go on. Sorry, no, go on. Sorry. Go on, Professor.
It is the role of mobilization and education based on accepting Islamophobia as a racism targeting Muslimness. If we can get that, make t-shirts, make cards, spread the word. Let's not fight around too much about its, how many angels you can fit on the head of a pin kind of thing. Understand the practical device.
I mean, so the way that you've answered it, there is a strong political / activism, theme and essence to the way that we need to combat this. So what about an alternative view, which is we can change Islamophobic attitudes by clearing misconceptions about Islam and exhibiting good Islamic models and behaviors? Wouldn't that be the more easier thing to do for the community, and perhaps the more effective one?
It would certainly not be more effective, because it misunderstands what Islamophobia is. Because one of the problems is this, that one of the things that talking about Islamophobia as racism does is also to educate Muslim community into the history of anti-colonial struggles. We Muslims community, and I've said this many times, we tend to know much better our canonical, our religious texts and our religious understanding than our historical understanding. Among this call, if I asked people, name me 10 famous Muslims which are not companions of the Prophet, you'll have a hard job. I can name them probably what they will come to, right? We just do not know enough about it, and that creates a certain kind of thing. We don't know the history of the struggles. We don't know the history of the rebellions of enslaved Muslims in the Americas. We do not know that. So we tend to think that if we were good Muslims, there would be no problem. But this is one of the most pernicious things, that it argues that Muslims are being attacked for the things they do. Islamophobia isn't a response to what Muslims do. It is a response to who Muslims are. Now,
Okay.
I'll give you a very good example of this. Everyone talks about 9/11. But the report, the Runnymede report, came out 1997. It was being written in 1996, 5 years before 9/11, before any major terrorist incident in this country. Why was it coming out before even 9/11 if this is only a response to 9/11? Islamophobia is not a response to Muslim misbehavior, as no more is racism a response to criminality among different communities. Remember that how you assign criminality to communities is racism itself. To give you a very simple example, in the United States, if a white man goes and kills 12 people, this is a problem of his madness, it's a problem of his own psychosis. It is not a problem of white men or whiteness. Muslim kills 12 people, we have to have an indictment of what is wrong with Muslim culture. The Yorkshire Ripper just died recently. Before him, Jimmy Savile. Both of these men hail from the same part of this country. I have not heard one commentary ever say, what is it about Yorkshire men that turns them into sexual offenders and murderers? I mean, maybe you have heard this.
No, point taken. I mean, it was just it was an argument that continues that continues to say that, had we been better Muslims, had we worked harder on educating people about this, we could have combated Islamophobia better. Well, thank you very much, Professor, for your time. I know there's several questions that are coming in, and I apologize to everybody on the call. We'll be unable to take this because we're trying to get as many sessions and as many speakers on the call. Can I first thank you on behalf of everybody who was responsible in organizing the call. And Professor, for your benefit, I would like to name MMCWA, Alessandra Wasel, Emma, Luma, Samasta, London Cultural Centre, and Strive UK in organizing this. And on behalf of everybody and a lot of well wishes, thank you so very much for joining us and for giving us your views on this. Thank you very much.